Now let's move on, because now I have the great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Caroline Edwards, lecturer in modern and contemporary literature at Birkbeck University of London. Caroline is co-director of the non-for-profit academic-led open access publisher, the Open Library of Humanities. Caroline's work on open access began when she founded the Open Access Journal of 21st Century Literary Criticism, Alluvium. In 2013, she founded the Open Library of Humanities together with Dr. Martin Eve. And in September 2015, in a few months, OLH is launching as a multidisciplinary journal publishing gold open access articles without any author-facing charges. Today, Caroline, you will talk to us and tell us about opening up open access beyond the sciences, learning from the Open Library of Humanities. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Caroline Edwards.
Can you hear me? No, you can hear me now. Okay. I've not worn one of these headsets before. I hope it doesn't fall off. Okay. Brilliant. Thank you so much for the kind introduction and for the invitation from the organising committee. I'm absolutely delighted to be speaking to all of you today, and I'll talk you through some of the key issues that are affecting open access from my perspective working in the humanities. Just before I start, just to give you a sense of who I am, perhaps, I work, as Beata was mentioning, in literature, so I'm an academic, and I specialise in 21st century literature. It is a real subject. I do often get asked if that's a proper topic of academic study. And it occurred to me whilst I was doing this research that I'm publishing and working with authors, from the last 5 or 6 years, for example, and yet when I come to publish a journal article, it can still take 2, sometimes even 3 years to get published. So it struck me that it's very contradictory in many ways to be trying to keep up with kind of the cutting edge of new publishing in contemporary British fiction in my field. And I wanted to think about, are there ways in which 21st century literature is obviously a fairly new and rapidly developing field. We have a number of postgraduate programs and undergraduate modules that specialise in 21st century literature in the UK. But could there perhaps be 21st century ways of disseminating this research? So I started experimenting with a small journal and thinking about openness, and thereafter I became involved in advocacy for the Open Library of Humanities, which I co-founded with Martin Eve. And in my experience in the last couple of years, going around and giving talks about open access, working with librarians, with publishers, with academics and other editors, that actually it's a real problem that many people don't have access to the materials that we publish in the humanities. And there's sometimes an argument made that the humanities are more slow-moving than the sciences, that we're not the same as scientific research in the STM subjects. We're not curing cancer, we don't work in medicine. Does it matter that we don't have access to scholarly materials? Yes, it does matter, and it matters very much when you think that there are a number of people who, for various personal as well as professional reasons, who can't access the materials that we're publishing in the humanities. So, for example, journalists who are doing research into kind of new topics that they need to report on, charities who may have been funding research that then perhaps is behind a paywall. And recently I discovered that in the UK, cabinet ministers and their secretaries dealing with matters of policy will not make any recommendations in their research based on materials, scholarly materials that they cannot access. So they are very limited to the kinds of materials that they can access as well. Okay, so just in today's talk then, I'm going to focus a little bit on the context in the UK. I'm hoping I can share with you some of the sense of what's happening back in Britain. I'd like to talk also about two kind of large pressures that are affecting the development of open access, and I'm calling them from above and from below. So from above, kind of institutional and policy recommendations and mandates. From below is a sort of sense that it's a very exciting time to be working in open access just now. There's a sort of emerging new ecosystem, and there are a lot of new and older and established projects. And the Open Library of Humanities, which I work on, is just one such project. I'll give you a few examples of some of the projects specifically publishing in the humanities. And then I wanted to finish up with some of the aspects of our publishing platform and some of the what I think are the very kind of exciting technological things that we can introduce. Can you all hear me? Is there a feedback? It's okay. Yeah, just wave at me if you're not being able to hear properly. Okay. So I'll just talk through some of these to start with then. So I mentioned there is a difference between the STM subjects and the humanities subjects. We find that the humanities lecturers have a different kind of attitude towards openness, and in many ways, for various different reasons, we're sort of lagging behind openness in the sciences and scientific publishing. The problem of academic prestige is something that I'll come back to a little bit later on in the talk, but as far as I'm concerned, this is the most significant challenge that we face. The technological challenges are not insurmountable. We're working with many others at different places, like the Public Library of Science, for example, people who are sharing open source software, who are able to customize their software. Those aren't really problems, although obviously they need sort of funding to be able to do these things. The problem is academics themselves. And I've no doubt, as many of you here are librarians, you'll know that it can be very hard to go to your academics in each university and persuade them to think more carefully about where they're publishing and to take that kind of responsibility for making sure that they are helping in a transition towards open access. So we meet with a certain amount of resistance. And in order to overcome that resistance, we need to think about how open access can be thought of as prestigious, as traditional scholarly publishing in print formats. The humanities subjects are also affected, or have been affected in the UK very much so, about debates about licensing. Sarah mentioned Creative Commons licenses a little bit earlier. There's been a number of controversies at quite a high level in the UK press, in places like the Times, Higher Education, and other, The Guardian and elsewhere, with various different academics arguing about whether or not they should be having Creative Commons licenses. And of course, there's the question here of what is the relationship between the scholarly journal article and the scholarly monograph. In the humanities, the monograph remains one of the most important publications that you can have. And I go around and speak to a number of early career researchers or younger academics in the UK, and they're very concerned. As you may know, in Europe, things are very difficult right now, entering into the profession as an academic, making that transition from doing a PhD and then going into part-time and fixed-term jobs and so on. The only thing that will help humanities scholars to become proper kind of tenured academics is the scholarly monograph. And so the challenges that we face in thinking through new funding models for how we might make our monographs open are complex. They require a number of negotiations with publishers, with editors, with academics themselves, as well as the institutions, and that includes the libraries as well as the universities. So, as you no doubt know then, library budgets have been severely affected over the last number of decades. Subscription costs have outstripped inflation by 300% since 1986. And this impacts substantially upon the humanities subjects. Humanities research is very strapped for cash, essentially. We're talking about very small departmental budgets. Anecdotally, one department I was in, we only had 3 library journals for that subject. And we were told if we wanted to go and get another library subscription, it was a one-in, one-out policy, and we would have to cancel one journal to take up a new one. So the problems that the humanities have is that many of these departments are extremely small, the budgets are very, very tight, and the costs have been rising above inflation. Another aspect of this problem, which the reason why openness and the open access debates are so important, is because they don't just affect academic researchers at university institutions. We're also very concerned, as I mentioned earlier, to be helping other kinds of people who might access materials. So there may be various different professionals who would like to be able to access the materials we're publishing, whose own debates and dialogue would be informed by our work. But also, we're actually talking about academics who are working outside of the university system. So a number of academics these days are working as what we call independent researchers, which means they may not have an official position at a university, and they may not have library access. And we feel very strongly that all kinds of academics should be helped in the transition to openness and shouldn't be isolated. So I understand that you are fairly well versed in open access issues, that you have these conferences every year, so I won't spend too much time explaining terms, but I did just want to mention the kind of distinctions between green and gold open access before I proceed with the rest of my talk. Green open access is the way in which things are primarily moving in the UK at the moment, after a lengthy process of consultation between HEFCE, which is our government wing for liaising with all of our different research and funding councils. And obviously the green route means that we would be uploading our articles into institutional repositories. Green is desirable, and it is definitely what academics seem to be preferring for reasons I'll come on to. But there are some problems, which is why the Open Library of Humanities model is moving towards a gold open access model. And some of the problems is that it does actually maintain some of the kind of systems of a status quo in academic publishing. It doesn't necessarily address the problems for library budgets. It still means that we're putting funding into commercial scholarly publishers whose profit margins can sometimes be extremely large. It doesn't necessarily help in terms of reuse rights, which can remain restricted. They might prohibit text mining and access to large sets of data, as we've been hearing from Sarah. Also, of course, with embargoes and embargo periods, it means that we still have delayed access. And another aspect that I think is uniquely addressing humanities research is that it's still very hard to actually cite green open access articles. If I self-archive a green article on my subject repository, the pagination is different, the final formatting is different. I'm not allowed to reproduce, I mean, it depends, but quite often you're not allowed to reproduce the precise final finished version that the publishers have expended their own editorial labour and copy editing labour. So in that sense, I might be able to read the article, and that's very useful, but I would still have to then go and find the proper version on the publisher's website. By contrast, the gold model, then, we're arguing, is going to challenge the conventional economic model for publishing. And we're already finding with a number of different open access projects that are addressing the gold route that more competition is bringing down costs for things like article processing charges. I mean, I remain skeptical as to how long some of these APCs will remain at a low and affordable level. I think perhaps they may be put up in a year or two after certain publishers have launched their hybrid versions or their open access wings. But it does mean then that we're reconsidering the economic foundations on which we publish. And I should emphasize, no doubt you know this already, but gold open access is not a business model. Gold simply refers to materials that are freely available at the moment at which they're published. And that can't be emphasized enough. It's a fact that's thrown around a lot in debate in the UK, where people assume that gold means APCs, partly because a number of scholarly publishers are suggesting that the APC model is the only way they can recoup lost labour costs. So the Open Library of Humanities is dedicated to demonstrating that gold does not have to have author-facing charges, because we believe that these are just unaffordable. So we are seeing then, as I mentioned earlier, these article processing charges are coming down from the initial costs. To give you just a few figures, I apologise, I don't have these on a slide just yet. Some of the journals from the Public Library of Science, their fees range from $1,350 to $2,900 per article. But of course, there are waivers if you argue that you cannot afford to pay and you don't have the funds, to publish your articles. At SAGE, in the SAGE Open Mega Journal that we have, the charges are currently about $195 up from $99, which was their launch cost. So we're already seeing that these article processing charges are sort of flexible right now, and it's quite a fluid environment. And then, of course, Taylor and Francis, another good example, their current cost is $2,950. So these are still very high. And of course, when we think about monograph publishing, there are a number of debates. There are pilot schemes taking place. Knowledge Unlatched is one example of a publisher who had a pilot project to see how affordable it could be to publish open access monographs, and whether they could develop a library consortium model for funding these. So these problems of cost that we find with the article processing charges, when we come to to book processing charges, or BPCs, the situation is exacerbated. Right now we have commercial publishers, including Palgrave Macmillan, who have suggested that their book processing charge is about $17,500. And other presses, for example, Ubiquity Press, a newer startup model company, have put the figure at about $3,200. So already you can see there are massive disparities, and I think in that sense, newer-led scholarly organised publishers in Gold Open Access have an advantage in that they have a kind of lean startup business model. They don't have the lumbering kind of overheads that the traditional scholarly publishers and university presses face, and they have access to open source technology, which is making it more affordable and cheaper. So the more of these open access projects that work together, the better it becomes for all of us, essentially. Okay, so I'd like to consider then the two kind of drivers that I'm arguing are driving open access just now, from above and from below. So the fact, as I've mentioned, that we have this library budget crisis, that the open access movement, which has been going now for sort of more than 15 years, has been developing, and of course developments in technology and using the internet means that there is more possibility to disseminate our research than there has ever been before. And this has led to the rise of national level institutional and funding council mandates for open access. So, for example, in the UK, we have HEFCE, the Higher Education Funding Council for England, which is connected with our government. We also have RC UK, the Research Councils UK. In Europe, we have Horizon 2020, and there are other research councils here, of course. You have your Swedish Research Council, in Australia, the Australian Research Council. So there are mandates which are coming from above, which are helping us to think about how we move towards open access. Some of these funders, such as the Research Council UK, have suggested a preference for gold open access. So in that sense, this is partly the reason why academics in the UK have responded so strongly and trenchantly. This idea that these mandates come from above, that they are top down, that they are being imposed upon academics, often against their will, is part of this psychological academic problem that we're trying to tackle with the Open Library of Humanities. So whilst it is very helpful for those of us who want to move towards open access to have these mandates, it's also things are changing very quickly, and it's starting to get quite complicated. Michael Jubb, who heads up the Research Information Network, which was the consultancy body, the group who helped chair the report into open access that was led by Dame Janet Finch in 2012 in the UK, that was received a lot of press attention, recently commented that there are more than 600 open access policies and mandates in force around the world, sometimes several in one single country. So I'm just going to talk you through a few of these. I'm referring here to the book Open Access and the Humanities by my colleague Dr. Martin Paul Eve, which is available open access from Cambridge University Press. So I definitely recommend you go and have a look at that if you haven't already. So in China, for example, the National Natural Science Federation and the Chinese Academy of Sciences have suggested a green route for depositing research within 12 months of publication. Over in India, there is no actual national mandate, but they have recommended an open access policy. So we see this in a number of countries where there are sort of strong recommendations, but sort of mandates are still in progress. In Brazil, there have been substantial advances in open access with the Scientific Electronic Library Online, which was launched in 1997, so they've been moving towards this for a number of years. And they also, despite the name, they actually host a number of humanities and social sciences journals, which helps us in the humanities. Australia has been moving in this direction as well. They have open access mandates for green deposits of articles within 12 months. And the Australian Research Council and other research councils, such as the Health and Medical Research Council, have been mandating. Over in Canada, they're working towards a unified open access policy, which is again focusing on the green institutional repository approach through their Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. France currently has a mixed ecosystem looking at green and gold. And Japan, the National Institute of Informatics, has quite recently established the relevant infrastructure for open access publication. They're currently giving equal weight to gold and green, which is quite interesting, insofar as the national funders are allowed to spend some of their money on APCs. So there's a question about whether nationally funded research should be supporting APCs. So there we have a very quick overview, and obviously this summary is constantly changing, as I mentioned, and it's worth bearing in mind that we should keep an eye on the international landscape. So these are some of the sort of top-down from above drivers towards open access. So I'd like to think actually a little bit more about the drivers from below. This is where our project at the Open of Library Humanities sits. A number of academics who, for various reasons, have decided that they have to take some agency, some responsibility, that the situation isn't good enough and we should actually be doing everything that we can to try and change things. So in many ways, if you chose, you could contextualize this within a longer scholarly tradition of hacking, for example, dating back to the 60s, 70s, 80s in North America at places like MIT, in Boston and so on. Academics who have various tech backgrounds, who are able to code, who are sharing their ideas with one another through open source tech and so on. This idea of thinking about open access being sort of developed from below raises a number of really interesting questions. What are our colleagues' attitudes towards open access? In the humanities subjects, many people have only really had to engage with open access very recently as a result of the 2012 Finch report into open access, as a result of HEFKI and HEFKI mandating open access for our next research excellence framework, the REF, in 2020. So they feel like this has suddenly happened to them, that we've actually been sort of sleepwalking through the last 3 decades, where as academic researchers we didn't have to worry about where our research was published. As long as it was in a journal that we had heard of that would be useful for our careers, the responsibility really ended there, and many people didn't take it much further. So we're having to address these attitudes, and we're having to kind of go on a charm offensive and go around persuading our colleagues that this is something that they should be doing that's good for them as well as good for society more generally. How have academics been responding to the serials crisis in scholarly journal publishing? Again, this is a matter of educating academics. And I would say at the OLH, we go around and we talk at different kinds of conventions. We talk to librarians, we talk to publishers, and we also talk to academics themselves. And I've really started to realize that academics don't always talk to their own librarians, and they certainly don't always talk to the publishers. And so we really need to think about a better way of articulating communication and collaboration across these different constituent groups, all of whom who are stakeholders in a move towards open access. In a sense, it helps that we're an academic-led organisation, because I think academics tend to kind of shut down when they feel like they're being told they must do something by a government mandate or by even the head of library services at the university. So I very much sympathise with your position, trying to encourage your researchers to think more carefully about open access. Other aspects of this kind of activist-led from below approach to open access is that there are a number of different innovations which are very exciting. It's interesting to note in the humanities, perhaps it's not surprising, there are some subjects more than others which are interested in experimenting with new forms of publishing. So I mentioned my own background in 21st century literature. A number of the scholars who work in the 21st century period are younger scholars who have recently graduated with their PhDs, and they're that much more likely to think about open access. They're more engaged on Twitter and social media. They're much more kind of clued into electronic learning environments that we have to use in our teaching. Another good example would be film and media studies, where actually it seems ridiculous that you would write about a TV show such as Game of Thrones, which was aired on Sunday, and you'd have to wait 2 years for your article to be actually peer-reviewed and finally published. So we're seeing a number of different models, and I'll mention one in a moment, of examples where academics in media studies are building new kinds of platforms, often journals, sometimes blogs as well, sometimes using WordPress. It also encourages us to ask what are the outputs of our scholarship? Does the scholarly journal article have to be 6,000 to 8,000 words long? Could it be 3,000 words long? Is it still a proper article? Is it still refable? It's a verb that we use, an adjective, sorry, that we use in the UK. Could it be 14,000 words long? Would we care to see iterations of the same journal article? Would we be interested in seeing the first draft and then perhaps the second or third draft with some sort of open peer review model where you could engage with your readers and then write up the product of that scholarly debate? Do we still think monographs need to be a certain length? We're tied still in the 21st century to a 17th century model of publishing according to a kind of print model which has this kind of logic of exclusion, whereby journals had to be a certain number of pages because of the cost of paper and the cost of the mail service to get all of these articles in the 1700s and so on posted out to the people who subscribe to them. We don't need that in the internet. Taking us into account the idea of where we host our data, actually, we can produce articles of any length that we like. And so finally, a question that I'm very interested in, I think is extremely important. What is the relationship between academic researchers, who themselves are the authors of material, who are the editors of material, the readers of that material, and often the reviewers as well, and the quote-unquote traditional scholarly publishers? Of course, scholarly publishing falls into an entire kind of spectrum. You have some of the sort of university presses who may be small, who maybe have been around for hundreds of years. We also have varying degrees of commercial and sometimes quite predatory publishers. And so how are academics relating to these? What kinds of decisions should we be making? And how can we help transition towards open access? So I'm going to talk you now through a series of concrete examples or case studies to show you what has been happening in humanities publishing in open access recently. So the first of these is a press called Open Humanities Press. They have been going for a few years now. They were founded in May in 2008. They are scholarly led by Gary Hall and his colleagues, and they call themselves an international open access collective. They are dedicated to critical theory, to a particular set of approaches. So they are interdisciplinary, but they're fairly politically oriented. They've published already, they have more than 16 journal titles as part of their press, and they have 5 different monograph series. In terms of the Open Library of Humanities, of course, we've been looking at the OHP, the Open Humanities Press, and thinking about our relationship to them and these 2 different projects. And one of the things that we found very interesting was their editorial board, which responds to that problem of prestige that I mentioned a little bit earlier. Their editorial board is incredibly distinguished. For anyone who knows about critical theory, they have some of the biggest names of extant philosophers, including people like Alain Badiou, Donna Haraway, Claire Colebrook, Brian Masumi, Bruno Latour, Antonio Negri, Douglas Kellner. It's kind of a roll call of people's heroes in those subjects. So it's very interesting that open access publications have to work even harder in a competitive marketplace than just a print journal, of which, of course, every single year a number of new journals are being set up, and we have increasingly large numbers of niche journals. It becomes impossible as a researcher I can't read all of the journals in my area. I don't even know all of the journals in my area. That's how many are being published. But if you're going to set up an open access publisher, whether it's just a single journal, whether it's a book series, whether it's an entire kind of publishing platform, it's absolutely vital that you get the right people on board from the start, that you have to present yourself to the world as being distinguished, rigorous, as having peer review. And these are debates we've been having at the OLH, even though we have very exciting ideas of how we might like to move towards different kinds of peer review, or post-publication peer review, or peer-to-peer review. Kathleen Fitzpatrick, who wrote a text called Planned Obsolescence, has a fantastic chapter all about these different projects. Even if you wish over the years to move towards different kinds of innovation in scholarly review, you have to start off with a fairly traditional structure, because there are so many challenges that we face in the humanities disciplines. So that's something that the OHP have been excellent at innovating, and they were sort of ahead of the curve in some ways, I think, in the humanities subjects. Another example then, which is a kind of in-development project, is run by the Media Commons Press. I mentioned a moment ago that media studies for contemporary film and TV are really leading the field in many ways in thinking about new kinds of engagement, new kinds of review, and new kinds of scholarly dialogue. And this is one very good example. The image here is Jason Mittel's recently published monograph, Complex TV, which came out with New York University Press in this year, 2015. So the project is part of the Media Commons. They have a web presence, they have a website you can go and visit. They specialize in media studies, and they publish what they refer to as digital texts through these kind of innovative projects. So they have a number of different projects that they're trialing, and it's sort of in a blog format. So there are constant updates, and you can see what they've been doing recently. So one example then is this idea of open review, of peer-to-peer review, or even crowd reviewing of manuscripts. So Jason Mittel's monograph was open for peer review, and you can go through and you can look through chapter by chapter. If you wish to go, or well, it's published now, but if you had wished to go and make a comment, you just simply sign in and respond to a specific paragraph. This is very new to humanities researchers. It might not be new in terms of the fact that we've had the capability to do this, but the kind of shift in academic attitude and the psychology of how we understand our relationship to our own work is massively transformative. Humanities lecturers see their work as polished, final, finished, bounded, discrete products. Very often when they're available as ebooks, they're a PDF. It's a static object. It's not even HTML, it's not something you can engage with. And the idea that you would put out your work for review before it's completely finished, because of course the way in which we communicate is our argument, is our research. We don't always have data sets. In that sense, our data is our words and our language. And so scholars are very, very hesitant about sharing their ideas before they think they're finished. One argument to counter this would be to say to scholars, as I often do when I get the chance, we go to conferences. I mean, academic conferences, such as this one, are the lifeblood of the humanities kind of research networks. And at a conference, it's very common to be presenting a new paper, perhaps a new idea that you're developing. You wish to get feedback from your colleagues. You'd like to have the opportunity to debate your ideas, get a different perspective, get a sense of context. Of course, in the 21st century, people are live tweeting your argument. So even with or without your permission, your argument and your ideas are out there on the internet. People have storified your tweets. They're already sharing them on blogs and reviews and things. So I would argue that we do have a kind of open process of working through draft arguments and draft ideas. But we're not familiar in the humanities with presenting them in an open review format. So the Media Commons project is very interesting as one such example where this has been working, and I think we're going to see more of these in the future. They host a blog called In Media Res. There are a number of such blogs available in TV, and the journal Alluvium that I run is modelled on this kind of format. So these are they presented as academic journals. They're written by sort of scholars in the field, but they're run through WordPress. It's incredibly easy these days. You don't need any computer or IT experience to set up a WordPress website, to put a nice template on top, run a kind of magazine format. You can have rolling publication. You can still have themed issues. I find it very interesting that we still have issues. We still like the idea that you publish once a month or once every 2 months, even though there's no reason for you to have to do so. But there's something about that sense of an event that people then look in on the journal and kind of tweet it and Facebook it and so on. So media studies then have a number of good examples. Antenna TV is another example of such a publication. They're short-formed, so they're kind of stretching our idea of what the scholarly journal is. Should it be peer-reviewed? Should it not? Can it just be a very quick article that's published about something that's incredibly contemporary and relevant to this month? For example, we published a special issue at Alluvium about Margaret Thatcher and contemporary British literature, and we published it the month after Thatcher's funeral. That would not have been possible in a kind of traditional print, peer-reviewed scholarly journal. You just can't have that level of instantaneity that often you need to be having. It makes it very useful for teaching as well, because I can share it with my students very quickly. Okay, another example, the Comics Grid. Interestingly, this is another academic-run journal. They originally set up using WordPress. They have now moved towards the platform that Ubiquity, I'll mention Ubiquity in a moment actually to give you some more information about them, but they're essentially a technological services provider for academic presses. And they use a customized version of Open Journal software, the OJS open source software that the Public Knowledge Project, PKP, in Canada have helped to establish. So the Comics Grid are very interesting. They launched in 2011. Again, another example of a new field. Comic studies is a relative newcomer to humanities disciplines. Like all newcomers, TV studies used to be the newcomer. Before TV studies, it was film studies. Before film studies, it was literature, which was just, what is it Shelley called it? Like women chatting about, novels that they like. All of these newer disciplines face a certain amount of kind of critique. And so comic studies felt that they had to demonstrate that they are a proper, rigorous kind of area of scholarship. And because they're such a new area, they should think about new formats for publishing. They set themselves up on WordPress because they were very interested in having social media tie-ins, Facebook, Twitter, various different plugins, subscriptions, and so on. And they wanted to challenge those traditional fixed academic paradigms for publishing. One of their co-founders, Ernesto Priego, who also works with us at the OLH, said something very interesting in an interview about the process of setting up this journal. And if I could just quote him, he said, "The paradigms or values implicit in the technologies, openness, transparency, interactivity, reciprocity, responsiveness, accountability, community, engagement, accessibility, affordability, widening participation, are not really leading or not leading quickly enough to a real transformation of mainstream academic culture as a whole." That quotation then is, I see that as a call to arms. We have the capabilities technologically to innovate with new kinds of journals and new formats of publishing. The problem is kind of reaching and opening up or cracking or fracturing or persuading these kind of traditional academic attitudes into reflecting on their own scholarly processes and realizing that actually, in many ways, humanities researchers, if they don't engage with openness, we're being left behind. Our disciplines are becoming irrelevant, and we face so many kind of crises of funding, particularly in the UK right now, that if we can't make ourselves relevant to society as a whole, if we can't demonstrate that our research has a benefit for the general social good, then we really are in trouble. So we need to be challenging these kind of traditional academic culture. Just to finish up, the Comics Grid then has this rolling publication format, which means that they publish articles as and when they're ready, shorter articles, and again, that sense of building a community. Okay, the Comics Grid is hosted by Ubiquity Press. They're an open access services provider for journals and monographs. They're a spin-off company from UCL in the University of London, run by academics. we are working with Ubiquity. So at the OLH, they are handling our document management system, they're handling our typesetting, proofreading, hosting, and preservation. We could have done all of these things ourselves, but we realized that it would have taken us perhaps a couple of years longer to launch had we not used their services. So they are one of our partners, if you like. They're very important insofar as they're helping to establish a divergent ecosystem of open access publishers, which is already bringing down costs. So their APCs for journal articles and for book publishing costs are coming down. Okay, so I'd like to finish up in the last 5 minutes then, just to give you a bit more information about the Open Library of Humanities and what it is. We are collectively funded, we are academic-led, we are moving towards gold open access publishing, and we call ourselves a mega journal, a multi-journal, and a monograph pilot. So that might sound like quite a lot to you, it might sound insanely ambitious, but we've actually realised that that level of ambition is precisely the reason why we've gained quite a lot of media attention and attention from funders. We've been funded so far by the Public Knowledge Project and also the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation over in the United States. By the term mega journal, what we mean is a large-scale journal which is across the humanities disciplines. So we're taking a fairly loose interpretation of humanities from theology, literature, modern languages, right the way over to political theory, political philosophy, legal studies, and sort of edging into sociology and some social sciences. By the term multi-journal, what we mean is that we're setting up a platform whereby branded journals can come onto our platform and can be published through the OLH. And as we've developed since we launched the project in January 2013, so we're now just over 2 years old, we've been a kind of community-led organisation and project so far. We found that actually humanities scholars really respect that niche kind of identity of their specific journal in their specific field, and that the idea of some kind of mega journal or the bucket model that some people refer to it to is very estranging and frightening and problematic for many of them. So we have a number of journals who will be moving to our platform when we launch. Just to give you some sense then of sort of how it works, the reason then that we have the multi-journal and the book publishing partnership, which is going to be a pilot study that we haven't started it yet, that will start in a couple of years most likely, is because we need to solve this question of prestige. We won't succeed if humanities scholars don't think we are as prestigious as all the other projects. So in that sense, we have to allow these smaller niche journals to maintain a full brand kind of autonomy whilst also being a part of our platform, and that can then deliver all of the exciting technological innovations that we are able to offer, which I'll say a little bit more about in a moment. The monographs, then, we have a preliminary agreement to publish a series of open access books in partnership with the following publishers: Harvard, Cambridge and Oxford University Press, and the Born Digital Open Book Publishers. This is very exciting for us because it would allow us to do a costing study with these publishers, with agreements, and then to release the information as to how much it has actually cost us to publish those books. Everybody then can see that information. And at the same time, working with traditional scholarly publishers allows us to have that dialogue and that relationship and to build the kind of prestige that we need to. Okay, I've already referred to prestige quite a bit throughout the talk, but just to sum up then, there is what we're calling a prestige trap in humanities publishing. This is the sense in which it's academics themselves who give prestige to a specific journal and then kind of outsource that and are then obliged to buy it back through their library subscription model. They have to buy back the products of their labour, their editorial labour, their review labour, you know, the actual articles that they write themselves. And so in that sense, the academics and the libraries currently remain entangled in a very complicated system of prestige, which has dramatic impact upon things like tenure, upon promotion, reward, funding, and so on. And so this is something we need to engage with at a very serious level. Okay, just to finish, because I suspect I've probably only got about 2 minutes before we move to some questions. The business model for our publishing project then at the OLH is what we're calling the Library Partnership Subsidy Model, the LPS. This is the model which allows us to have no author-facing charges, to have no APCs. This model then means that essentially we have a large number of libraries all joining the LPS scheme, contributing a small amount, which we think is very economically viable, and then we all kind of put the money into a pool, and out of that pool come the costs that we have. So we have to obviously cover the costs of publication, copy editing, and so on. Right now, we have more than 60 libraries around the world who have already signed up to our model. We have a number in the United States, including Duke University, Gettysburg College, Milligan College, Virginia Tech. They are joining us through the Lyrasis kind of library consortia, which organizes the services, if you like, for us. We have an exclusive partnership with them in North America. We have block support from the Galileo Consortium, which is over 2,000 institutions in the state of Georgia. So we're delighted that the entire state of Georgia is supporting our model. 12 libraries in Canada so far. The UK will be opening shortly. It's being managed by JISC Collections. And we're also building links in Europe as well. So the model is already working. We will launch in September with the actual academic content. And just to finish up, I've been out-memed by Sarah, but I wanted to finish with a meme, which I thought was great. The thing that excites me the most as an academic researcher is not just opening up our research in the ways that I've described, but actually changing the tech that we use. So we're building our own customized annotations tools, and these kinds of tools have substantial advantages for teaching and research. It means then that scholars can go onto an article, they can have a scholarly dialogue, they can actually go in and comment on the specific paragraph or line of the article, they can tweet it really easily, they can link it to Facebook, they can talk to the author. One of the things that we're customizing at the OLH, which to my knowledge I don't think anyone else has, is a privacy setting. So you can curate your own overlay journal within the OLH and you can make that private. You can make that private perhaps because you want to use it for your teaching. And so only you, the lecturer, and your students have access to that private overlay, and you can have your own comments and your own discussion that nobody else needs to see. If you feel comfortable, you can open that privacy setting and you can make that an open discussion. This idea then of opening up our research to anybody and having that kind of scholarly argument and engagement, it kind of blows my mind. To me, it is just such a different way of doing things. The humanities for so long have been trapped behind paywalls. On average, 3 or 4 people might read your article in its entirety, and you probably won't meet them or talk to them. So I think at the OLH, we're trying to combine a new funding model and demonstrate to people that it can work, that it is viable and affordable, and also introduce some new, technological components to the platform. We're very excited to see where this goes. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thanks, Caroline, for this most informative and inspiring speech or talk. We have time for a couple of questions, or we make ourselves time. But before that, I would like to thank you with a small gift.
Thank you so much.
A Swedish gift and also a Malmö gift.
Thank you, that's beautiful.
Enjoy it, and really nice to have you here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. Okay, one or two, maybe, short, interesting questions. Yes, over there.
Yeah, keep it interesting.
Camilla Lindelöf, Södertörn University. So thanks a lot for your presentation. Really interesting to hear. Could you just explain a little bit more about the case studies and the uptake among researchers outside the UK and the US?
Yeah, do you mean the journals I was referring to, like the Comics Grid and things like that? It won't be an informed response because I'm not on their editorial board. But I can talk a bit more about Alluvium, for example, the journal that I set up. So I look at all the website statistics. I can see who's accessed the journal, how long they've spent on each page, all of the Google Analytics information. It's very international. I've now handed over editorial work to an editorial team, one of whom is my PhD students. But when I was doing it, I would frequently sort of update the top 10 cities around the world where people were reading the articles. And I was really struck by just how international they were. And that kind of exposure for our research, it's just not possible without the internet. There's no way my articles will be read by someone in Sri Lanka whose university library budget can't afford, the subscription model. So it's hard for me to give you concrete data, but yeah, anecdotally, I think it is very important. I didn't have a chance to talk about the international challenges, but we have an internationalization committee on the OLH where we discuss questions and problems facing libraries around the world. And there are astonishing statistics. If you compare the pricing, the amount of money that somewhere like Harvard University is, that's the library budget that has the largest budget in the world, with various places in Africa, for example, in Asia, that they have such tiny budgets. We really need to be sharing this material with them. Yeah.
Thank you. Maybe one more question? Yes. Down here we have one.
Hi, thank you. Jutta Heider from Lund University. Thank you for a very inspiring and informative talk as well. I have two, one sort of a comment and more of another comment, which is also a question. The one is that you have these two drivers, drivers from above and drivers from below. And I was wondering if you wouldn't like to add like a drivers from the side, because librarians, they've been actually the ones that've been driving the open access movement from the start, and they seem to be quite invisible in that sort of characterization of how the open access movement gains ground now. So the other thing was that in your talk, return a lot to it's just a question of prestige. It's just a question of the academics. It's just us. We have to change our ways of working. And I wonder if it's not also needed, and to try some of it. And I wonder how we can complicate this issue a bit more and make it more nuanced. It's like if you formulate it that way, there's a danger of putting it as if it actually was just the academics who are actually in control over their own work time, when it's in fact a struggle that goes on right now, especially in the UK. I know about who is actually in control over the work and the labor academics are doing, and how can we as academics control that. So I think that has to be added to the discussion as a more, in other terms than just a matter of prestige that we can sort of easily overcome when it's actually careers and making a living. That's also at issue, and it's also it relates to research policy is a double standard as well, of course, because there's a lot of openness and open access and open data and promoted by in the form of research policy trickling down. At the same time, it's also trickling down in form of quantification, evaluation, and measurement, and there's a sort of a drive to incorporate open access in that model of evaluation, because making it open, it also makes it more easy to evaluate and quantify, and that's also something the open access movement has to relate to in a way, and not just the sort of hacker spirit, which is nice and good, but there's another open access as well, which is part of the discourse as well.
I missed the first part where you said the sideways is the open access movement itself. Was that your point?
No, you frame it as like the you have the from above, which is policies and Horizon 2020, and research councils, and from below, which is the academics. But in fact, librarians and libraries have been very strong drivers in these changes towards open access, or making it visible in the first place, making it possible as a discussion topic in many ways. So I think probably it would be interesting to add those sort of institutions or people also to the presentation in the future.
I completely agree with you. I do agree that it's librarians who drive it more. My role at the OLH is to go and speak to academics. So forgive me if I'm slightly more focused on the academic side. The point I'm trying to make is that academics haven't taken any responsibility as yet in the same way that libraries have. And in my experience, the librarians can often feel quite frustrated that they're trying to push for open access. They're trying to help academics, and academics just don't always want to listen. One of the problems that we have is kind of a workload issue, that academics are so sort of overstretched in various different ways because of budget cuts, because we don't always replace jobs that are lost and so on. They just feel like this is another thing that's been added. Right, you want me to do all of this emailing, I spend 3 hours every day emailing, I have to do all of this electronic stuff, and now you're trying to make me do this as well. So thank you for your point, I agree. I'm trying to speak to academics.
It wasn't a critical point, it was just a sort of a thought.
Yes, you're right, yeah.
Okay, we have to round up now. Thanks again,
Thank you very much.
Caroline, and thanks for all these questions. Yes, and I give the word to Peter Nylén from Malmö Högskola. Well, thank you.
Lite praktisk information. Vi började 1 minut för tidigt, men likväl så rinner tiden iväg. Vi ska ses igen 20 minuter över 3. Lite fika serverar sig utanför, där restaurangen där ni åt lunchen, buffén. Toaletter finns snett mitt emot receptionsdisken på vänster sida i den riktningen.